My name is Oliver Cornock, and I'm joined today by Souhir Mzali, who is the regional editor for Africa here at Oxford Business Group. Souhir, welcome. I'm calling you from London, and we're going to talk today about the era that's about to begin of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. I just would love to hear a little bit from you about your take on this coming to fruition finally. It's been some time in the making, and what it really means to the nations that have signed up in the short term.
Yep, thank you very much, Ollie. And yes, indeed, exciting times for Africa at the moment. So, as you know, this deal was initially signed by almost 50 countries back in early 2018, but that was only the first step of the process. Now, in order to bring it into force, the deal required that a minimum of 22 nations actually ratify it. And that's what's most recently been achieved, with the Gambia signing off on it in early April. So what does this mean now for the agreement? Well, the next step would be for all those who've actually ratified it to reach out to the African Union with the ratification documents. And it's only until then that the deal can be fully implemented. And I personally don't see this taking a great deal of time, Ollie, especially if we consider how fast the whole process has actually moved forward since last year. But I think more
just for our listeners, what role is the African Union playing with the agreement? Are they driving this forward?
Yes, indeed. So it's the African Union that is spearheading the whole agreement and driving it forward. And the whole idea was born with them. And yes, they are the ones overseeing the ratification process and so forth.
Okay. And are there any notable countries that are not signatories in this 22 cohort?
Yeah. Well, out of the so last year, as I said, almost 50 signed it, and all those countries were actually expected to actually ratify it. And so far, we have 22 who have done so. There are many other countries that will potentially sign on, but that's still work in progress at the moment.
Okay, and how, when you're speaking to business people in the various countries that we at Oxford Business Group cover, how's the business community reacting to this news?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's a great question, Ollie, because you know, we always want to get a sense of what's really going on the ground as well. And indeed, Oxford Business Group actually conducted its second business barometer for Africa throughout 2018. And the overwhelming majority of the respondents to our survey were quite optimistic about the prospects of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. We had 72% of our respondents say that the deal will have a positive or very positive impact on intra-regional trade levels. So I think the message is pretty clear that Africa's leaders are upbeat about the deal. Obviously, this is not to say it's going to be smooth sailing. There are indeed a number of challenges that are going to have to be addressed in order for the full benefits of the deal to be felt.
And I think that's a very important point, because, of course, in many respects, African nations have suffered from a lack of integration, a lack of cross-border cooperation. Do you think this positivity then is coming from the fact that many of these countries' bilateral relations are actually starting from quite a low grade?
Well, I mean, I'm glad we're talking actually about some of the challenges and, you know, the fact that Africa is slightly behind when it comes, or actually quite behind when it comes to intra-regional trade volumes, you know. I think intra-regional trade volumes account for less than 20% in Africa. And now this compares to over 50% in Asia and more than 60% in Europe. So Africa definitely has some way to go in that regard.
Good. And in terms of in terms of growth more broadly, what do you see? What do you identify as the biggest single challenge as a region at the moment to growth?
Well, I would say there are a couple of challenges that we could identify, and one of them would be infrastructure. Infrastructure is something that has long held back development in Africa, generally speaking. And even though a lot has been achieved, a lot remains to be done. In terms of achievements, one country that springs to mind is actually Djibouti. Djibouti, where 3 ports have been added in the past couple of years. A railway linking its capital to that of Ethiopia has been set up, and they recently inaugurated the first phase of what is to become the continent's largest free trade zone. So a lot is happening across the region.
And so here, just on Djibouti, I think it's important for our listeners. Where's the funding coming from that? You know, we hear a lot about China's role in Africa.
Yeah.
How present is China in this?
Yeah, China is actually quite present. In fact, almost all of the developments I just mentioned were actually carried out by the Chinese. That's to say that it's just the Chinese that are present in Djibouti. There are many other countries that are also present in Djibouti. In fact, there's a lot of foreign interest going into Djibouti in the past few years. And, you know, to some extent, it's understandable. Even though it's a very small country, it only has 900,000 inhabitants. It is very strategically located. You know, it borders one of the world's busiest trade routes, but also one of the continent's most dynamic economies, which is Ethiopia. And now 90% of Ethiopia's trade is said to actually transit through Djibouti. So in that sense, there is a lot of interest going into Djibouti, and Djibouti has this clear vision of becoming a gateway into Africa, and, you know, somewhat of a logistics hub in the Horn of Africa.
When we look at the OPG Business Barometer for Africa, leadership skills were identified as being in great demand in Africa, and that really was a very clear finding of the survey. What steps are being taken in the countries that we at Oxford Business Group cover, and how successful are they being? I mean, clearly not as successful as they need to be.
Indeed, Ollie. And what's interesting here is to see that there's actually some consistency from one year to the next. In our business barometer, we had more or less the same number of respondents coming back and identifying leadership as the skill in greatest need in Africa. And I think the challenge here becomes more recognizable if we consider the size of the continent's young population. It's estimated that 60% of Africa's people are under the age of 24. It's also estimated that by 2035, the continent's working population will increase by 900 million people. Now, that's a lot of people to hire and jobs to create, especially if we compare with Europe, for instance, where this number is actually expected to drop by 85 million people over the same period, and more than double that in China. So the challenge ahead is no small one. Especially if we consider that only 3 million jobs are created every year for approximately 10 to 12 million young Africans entering the job market.
Yeah, I mean there's some fairly staggering figures there. Just obviously, it's impossible not to talk about jobs and skills without talking at the same time about education. I just wonder whether you could give some insight into what the environment is like at the moment in terms of developing education to produce graduates fit for the jobs of tomorrow.
Yeah, well, I think there is a clear need first to identify and recognize the skill sets that are actually lacking today in Africa. And most importantly, perhaps those that are likely to be needed to fill the jobs of tomorrow. And I would say public-private sector collaboration can go a long way in helping set these goals. There is evidence already of places where this has been successfully carried out. Morocco's aeronautics industry, for example, springs to mind here. I think the other discussion that could be had with regards to digital transformation and its role in education. I think it's become evident today that there is a digital revolution underway in Africa, and its benefits are slowly becoming known. The World Bank has it that digital transformation has the potential to see GDP per capita increase by 1.5 percentage points a year. So this is definitely a major area that warrants more attention, and where youth engagement is vital for the transformation and future of Africa.
So before we finish, I'm asking all of our regional editors at Oxford Business Group this question at the end of our frequent podcasts. What do you come across in your meetings, in your research, in your visits, that you can identify as sort of an unsung, underheard area that you think warrants more attention from the global business community?
Well, definitely two spring to mind immediately, Ollie. One is agriculture and the next is ICT. Agriculture, as you know, is because most of African economies depend on that one sector. And there's been a lot going on in the past few years to actually integrate technologies into agriculture to improve productivity, to ensure, you know, it's a sector that remains attractive. There is a big issue of the aging population in Africa occupying, you know, the role of a farmer and a producer, and you know, it's becoming less and less appealing to the younger generations. So by integrating more technologies into this very crucial sector to the African economy, I think there's plenty of potential to attract more young people into it in the coming years.
I suppose though the involvement of higher levels of cutting edge technology is likely in the short term to face the criticism of actually reducing jobs, not increasing them.
Indeed. Well, there's definitely that one argument to be made. But there are definitely new kinds of jobs that are actually being created. And I can tell you one thing for sure in Africa, that technology is having a huge impact on the employment and unemployment levels and the kind of jobs that are being created. I think of one example that is Kenya. You know, they've done a fantastic job since I think the mid 2000s with their M-Pesa program, which is an e-mobile money payment method, and this has created quite an interesting number of jobs and different types of jobs as well that, you know, were not necessarily visible when this whole practice emerged back in the mid 2000s.
Indeed, M-Pesa a significant success story, tackling the major issue of populations within the developing world that are not banked. The increasing bankable population is one of the great goals. So yes, technology there really working to enhance living standards, create jobs, and develop the future. On that, I think it's time to close. But thank you very much, Souhir. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much, Ollie. Thank you.